Hello, everybody. Just want to start with acknowledging that we're on unceded Indigenous lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam. Tonight, what I'm going to talk about are basically the similarities between Canada and Israel as settler societies, and how this influences the relationship that exists between Canada and Israel today. Also, I want to start by acknowledging as well that this connection and this comparison, there's nothing new about it. These connections have been made by Indigenous people of Turtle Island as well as Palestinians, as far as I know, at least back since the 1970s. Mm-hmm. There was one example is there was a joint declaration from the American Indian Movement and the Palestine Liberation Organization where they declared formal solidarity, or to quote, a united resistance to a common form of a common form of oppression. And also, even locally within the organizing in Vancouver, again, this connection has been made by Indigenous people and Palestinians since the 70s. And that includes people in this room, such as Hannah Kawas, and the work that his organization at the time did in collaboration with the Native Study Group, included opposing the visit by Moshe Dayan, for example. So this is really, this is just a sort of a continuation of a comparison and a solidarity that's gone on at least since the 70s. So as Charlotte touched on, it's fairly clear and it's fairly well known that the Canadian government is a strong supporter of Israel and its policies of apartheid and its policies of occupation against the Palestinian people. I just have a quick quote I want to read, which is actually off of the Government of Canada's website from the Department of Foreign Affairs. And if you search under Canada and Israel, the page is called Canada and Israel Relations. And as the site explains, Canada and Israel have strong, multidimensional bilateral relations marked by close political, economic, social, and cultural ties. Support for Israel, especially its right to live in peace and security with its neighbors, has been at the core of Canada's Middle East policy since 1948. The relationship has been strengthened in recent years as evidenced by increased cooperation in several areas, including public security, defense, trade and investment, and the increased frequency of ministerial visits. Canada and Israel marked 60 years of diplomatic relations on May 11th, 2009. On this occasion, Prime Minister Stephen Harper stated, "At the heart of relations between Canada and Israel is the dynamism of our shared communities. We look forward to the next 60 years and beyond." So I think what's really important to break down, and I think more work needs to be done within Palestine solidarity circles in Canada, is understanding why Canada supports Israel the way it does. Certainly, the current government has shown more overt support for Israel and is heavily influenced by Christian Zionism. There has been the deepening of economic ties between Canada and Israel, especially since the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement of 1997. But I think it goes a lot deeper than just the policies of the current government. Again, this support by Canada for Israel and basically the project of Zionism predates the state of Israel itself. Both Lester B. Pearson, who before he was the Prime Minister of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Justice Ivan Rand played very prominent roles in drafting and getting support for the 1947 UN plan to partition Palestine. So this is what's happening right now is a continuation of Canada's historic policy of support for Israel and its crimes. And the fact that both Canada and Israel are colonial settler societies with similar histories and a similar nature means that they have shared interests, especially in the realm of international politics. Both Canada and Israel are founded on the displacement of Indigenous people, the theft of their lands, and as a result, the impoverishment of Indigenous people of both of these lands. And in both cases, both the colonial processes and resistance by Indigenous people to these processes continue. So in terms of what in terms of what Canada's stake is in supporting Israel the way it does, I'll get to that more a little bit later. But first, I just want to draw some comparisons of the processes of Canadian and Israeli colonization. Because in this way, given that Canada kind of had a head start at this, one of its most important gifts or contributions I think it's made to Israel is really providing it with a playbook, a real-life how-to guide for establishing and maintaining a settler society, including various tactics, strategies, programs for taking land, a number of which Glenn has already discussed, ways to subjugate an indigenous population, weaken their resistance. So I'm going to go through just some general examples, and these are just ways that the processes are similar. This is not a history of the colonization of indigenous people here or in Palestine. And it doesn't do any justice to the complexities of these processes and the challenges and damage done to indigenous people by Canadian or Israeli colonization. As Glenn already discussed, the Indian Act of 1876, certainly the centerpiece of Canada's version of apartheid. Another aspect was, of course, the reservation system. This was a key aspect of the displacement of indigenous people from our traditional territories, was the use of reservations as a policy of containment. And this is what I guess is sort of the multimedia aspect of my presentation. Someone needs to take pity on me and teach me PowerPoint, but I don't know how to use it. I can pass this around. I think most people who are familiar with the history of the colonization of Palestine have seen this graphic or a similar representation. And for people who are, I've heard a lot of people say when they're first learning about the issue, like this is sort of what explained it to them. When I saw this, it explained to me how the process was similar to Canada. Just a consistent but somewhat gradual, at times, process of theft of land with the use of containment. And this image reflects Israel's process of the colonization of Palestine. Similarly, it started somewhat gradually with Zionist settlement beginning in earnest during the first decades of the 20th century. And the process that culminated with the 1948 Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe, which saw the displacement of over 750,000 Palestinians from what then became the State of Israel on 78% of historic Palestine. This process of land theft deepened after the 1968 occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, with the expansion of Jewish-only settlements in the occupied territories. And this is a process that continues to the present. And not just in the occupied territories, but even within the borders of Israel, in terms of Palestinians being displaced from their homes, from their neighborhoods, and from their lands. Another tool that was used in the past by the Canadian government against Indigenous people was the pass system. The pass system was instituted in 1885, and under this system required permission for any Indigenous person to leave the reserve. If they were going to leave, they needed permission from the local Indian agent. They had to fill out a pass giving the reasons why they were leaving the reserve, the duration. This included travel even from one reserve to another, and even for the purposes of selling one's labor to work in the farms of a white settler, you needed a pass. Now this pass, again, it said 1885. When this was instituted, it was justified as a means to monitor Indigenous people in the context of the Northwest Rebellion, to limit support for that rebellion, and to discourage participation in it. It was also justified as a temporary measure, but according to numerous oral histories of Indigenous elders, the pass system was in use, especially in the Prairie provinces, at least up until the 1940s. This model of restricting the basic rights of Indigenous people to mobility within their own lands, it lives on today in Palestine. It includes the systems of permits, checkpoints, and the apartheid wall, restricting and regulating movement of Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, along with the hermetic siege of Gaza as the most extreme expression of control over movement to, from, and within the Palestinian occupied territories. Another tool, or sort of, I guess, more of a strategy, which Glenn has already discussed, is that of so-called negotiations as an extension of colonial power. Even in the treaty period, on Blackfoot, and our land was taken under Treaty 7, which was negotiated in 1877. There's a lot of controversy about the legitimacy of the treaty in terms of whether or not any people actually signed it, if the people did sign it, whether they truly had the authority to do that from their communities. And even just in terms of basic language barriers, the disparities in terms of what's on the treaty versus oral history is vast. But what did definitely happen was a process of negotiation and an encampment. And in that encampment, the area where the different indigenous communities were camped out was completely surrounded by the Northwest Mounted Police, which is now the RCMP, of course. It was surrounded by the police with the cannons pointed inward to the camp as a show of force. So this is continued. This is Canada's idea of peace talks. And Glenn has already discussed the ways that this has continued and has deepened. And the same type of completely dishonest type of negotiations or peace talks has been tried many times by Israel against the Palestinian national movement. We can look at Oslo I, Oslo II, the Roadmap for Peace, the Annapolis Summit, the Quartet-sponsored peace talks, Egypt-brokered peace talks, and it just goes on and on and on. But I think in terms of the use of negotiations and roping people into this as a way to actually just continue with the colonial process, it's the same type of business, and it's had the same types of results for Palestinians as it has for indigenous people. The last similarity I want to mention is that's affecting both indigenous people here and in Palestine is the ever-growing influence of neoliberal so-called solutions as a way to deal with the social and economic problems facing us. Whether these are being pushed upon us by the colonizer, advocated by certain of our leaders, or a combination of both. It was about, I guess it's been about 6 months ago now, people probably remember when Mahmoud Abbas went to the UN with the so-called statehood bid, which is severely criticized by Palestinians at the grassroots level. But it's important, what I want to point out is that one basis of support for the statehood bid was from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. In a couple of years leading up to this statehood initiative, they produced reports where they argued that based on certain economic indicators and development of infrastructures, Palestinians were quote unquote now ready for a state. There's no discussion of occupation and how this affects the ability of Palestinians to develop and maintain their economy. No discussion of the tenuous nature of any infrastructure or economic development in Palestine when it can be knocked over by bulldozers or bombed, as this happens on a regular basis by Israeli forces. But these similar strategies are being pursued and pushed on Indigenous people. Glenn mentioned the BC Treaty process. It's very, very slowly being pushed in different ways by the Assembly of First Nations. And definitely in terms of advisors of the current Conservative government and from outside of the Indigenous communities, neoliberal strategies are being pushed on us quite heavily. Just an example of this thinking, I have an article here. This is from the National Post from the summer. It was called Aboriginals Need Roadmap for Success, Not Ideology. And this is written by Joseph Quinnell. He's a analyst for a think tank that is unironically called the Frontier Center for Public Policy. So just to give you a quote, just to give you a sense of what this sounds like in this context, he starts the article with a question. Is it necessarily right-wing to recognize the role of the free market in elevating populations out of poverty? Accepting the reality of the success of free markets is not really a right-wing argument, but a mainstream acceptance of reality. Admittedly, my preferences are for societies with a free market and limited government, but those views have the added bonus of being ideas that produce the greatest good for the greatest number in societies they have been attempted. My hunch is a debate that has been resolved all around the world that government ownership of the economy does not work and closing oneself off from the economy is bad, has not permeated Aboriginal discourse because academics and activists involved are ideologically opposed to capitalism despite evidence. They mythologize natives as communally oriented and want to keep Aboriginals from the dreaded free market. Sadly, they would rather see natives held back than admit political and intellectual failure. It is essential we provide booming Aboriginal populations with the tools they need to capitalize on property. They need a roadmap to succeed and not discredited ideology. I mean, yeah, there's a lot there. You know, I mean, it's just to think that there's somehow to talk about the existence of a free market, let alone the benefits of it, is not ideological, for example. But I think in both the context of Indigenous people here and in Palestine, what's underlying this approach is that basically we should forget about the histories of colonialism and just talk instead about, you know, how can First Nations be integrated into the economy and out of a so-called dependence. Without any sense of history, there isn't a concept of basic rights, sovereignty, the injustice that we faced, reparations. And as much as this article is kind of ridiculous, again, this is, you know, it's maybe kind of cheap to rely on the National Post, but these things are really being pushed, you know, and they are scary. So this, I did again. These are just a few, hopefully not too many, examples of the ways in which the processes of settler colonialism here and in Palestine are similar. And I think this shared colonial history is crucial to understanding Canada's support for Israel. The similar nature of the two countries as settler states creates a solid foundation for an ideological affinity, where from the Canadian standpoint of view, there's nothing particularly problematic or controversial that a predominantly European population would set up a state in the lands of a racialized people, displace those people, and settle the land. And in fact, actually, this positioning is from the point of view of Canada, is one to be celebrated, where Israel is lauded as this outpost of civilization, much in the same way that the colonization of Turtle Island was justified as a so-called civilizing mission, whether that was couched in traditions of European Christianity or narratives of modernization. But I think the main area where Canada benefits from its support of Israel has already been touched on, which is that the realm of international politics. This is the main site where Canada plays the most significant role as a proud and uncritical defender of Israel against attempts to address any of the numerous human rights violations of international law, and war crimes that it commits. Canada has its own interest in ensuring that Israel maintains immunity from these, because this is a site where Canada is also regularly, at least attempts are made for accountability for its treatment of Indigenous people. Just in the last 3 months, in December of last year, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women announced that it would launch an inquiry into the murders and disappearances of Indigenous women and girls across Canada. A few weeks ago, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination condemned Canada's treatment of Indigenous people in terms of the continued extreme disparities in living conditions of Indigenous people versus the rest of the population. At the same time, that committee also condemned some of the recent changes to Canada's immigration policy. It's important to point out. Also, in the last couple of weeks, the chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission made a statement that the residential schools should be looked at as a form of genocide. It's not notable that this was said because Indigenous people have been saying this for years and years and years. But I think it was significant coming, given that this chair was a person appointed by the Conservative government making these statements. But also some of the statements he made, he also pointed out the ways that Canada has sought to undermine its own culpability for violations of international law, and specifically the crime of genocide. Just a quick quote from the story from the Globe and Mail from February 17th. The chairman of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission says removing more than 100,000 Aboriginal children from their homes and placing them in residential schools was an act of genocide. Justice Murray Sinclair says the United Nations defines genocide to include the removal of children based on race, then placing them with another race to indoctrinate them. He says Canada has been, this is the key part, he says Canada has been careful to ensure its residential school policy was not caught up in the UN's definition. And this is quoting from him, "That's why the Minister of Indian Affairs can say this was not an act of genocide. But the reality is that to take children away and to place them with another group in society for the purposes of racial indoctrination was and is an act of genocide." And so I think this is like the biggest, to me, this is the biggest area where Canada gains from standing with Israel. And it's not, I should say too, it's not just, in addition to the use of the UN as a means to address human rights violations against Indigenous people, in the international arena, Canada's come under increased scrutiny for many other of its policies, including the environmental effects of the exploitation and expansion of the tar sands, its continued export of asbestos to the global south, and as I already mentioned, the recent changes to its immigration policy. So when Canada is defending Israel, I think it helps Canada stay out of culpability in a number of ways. The first is that it helps keep the United Nations and its various institutions weak and unable to properly uphold standards or prosecute violations of international law, whether it's by Israel or by Canada or by any other country. And it also does, of course, I think there is the factor of back scratching going on, that Canada's consistently doing this for Israel, and in the times where it's Canada's turn, that we expect Israel to return that favor. And then another way that the Canadian government benefits from its relationship with Israel is by gaining access to Israel's experience and tools of repression, be it for their uses here, quote unquote, at home, or in the case of leasing Israeli drones, Canada's operations in Afghanistan. This desire by Canada for Israel's expertise in matters of repression underlies the 2008 Canada-Israel Declaration of Intent for Cooperation on Public Security Issues. This is a document that was signed by representatives of both governments, and it outlines Canada and Israel's, and I'm quoting here, common threats to border security, illegal immigration, and terrorist financing. And in some ways, Canada has really developed its own vast experience in terms of police, the use of police and military to subdue Indigenous resistance. But I think Israel has much to share to Canada in the way of the more sort of 21st century high-tech means of policing, security, and intelligence gathering that's developed over decades of its repression and warfare against Palestinians. And in addition to the more overt forms of violent repression, this also includes the repeated use of the terrorism label to try and smear and discredit the Palestinian movement. This is a type of smear that's been used more and more regularly by the Canadian government and its propaganda wars against Indigenous people asserting their basic rights. And recently has been used against both Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations that are opposing both the expansion of the Alberta tar sands and its associated pipeline projects. So just to conclude, I think it's essential for the successful Palestine solidarity work in Canada that the colonial nature of Canada be recognized. For Canadians working to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, it must never be forgotten that Indigenous people here are struggling every day to survive the numerous ways in which Canadian colonialism and apartheid has damaged and continues to damage the original people whose land this country was built on. And I don't think it's simply a matter of being morally consistent in opposing apartheid and settler colonialism, as important as that is. But I think for any struggles for justice or solidarity going on within Canada, people need to bear in mind how all these struggles benefit in the long term by supporting Indigenous struggles for sovereignty, due to the unique way in which these struggles directly challenge the hegemony of Canadian capitalism and the damage done by that capitalism. And I think this holds true as well for non-Indigenous people living within Canada. In addition to the fact that that a lot of other like racialized communities in Canada are targeted by the same types of racist attacks, same types of smears. So I think this really opens up space for an anti-racist front that is beneficial. And also, really, I think for non-Indigenous people here who care about Palestine and want to support the Palestinian struggle, I think it's really essential to come to terms with what it means to be part of another society, and the ramifications for this, for Indigenous people and settlers, and really coming to terms with what all this means it will only make the ability to support the Palestinian struggle against Israeli settler colonialism stronger. And then just finally, I think, for Indigenous people here, in terms of the importance of us supporting the Palestinian struggle, as I said, it's nothing new. This connection's already been going on. But the principle of solidarity, I mean, we're many different communities and nations within the borders of Canada, but we've come together time and time again. And that solidarity comes naturally. Some argue that's part of what makes us Indigenous. So to me, it's just extending that to another Indigenous people who are not within the borders of Canada. It makes us stronger, and there's also a lot of experience to be shared. That's it. Thank you.